Inga mana, inga rea, inga tā wira pumanawa, ro rakatira ma, tena koutou, tena tātou katoa. Good evening, everyone. My name is Harlene Hain, and I have the great privilege of being the Vice Chancellor here at the University of Otago. And it is with great pleasure I welcome you to this inaugural professorial lecture for Professor Lachy Paterson. Now, on behalf of the university, I'd like to begin by extending a particularly warm welcome to the members of Lachy's whānau who are here to support him this evening. First, to his partner, Associate Professor Angela Wanhala. Kia ora. But also, we have a number of family members who have traveled quite some way to be here this evening. His mum, Sylvia, and his brother, Gavin, are here from Whakatane, is that correct? His sister Jay and her partner Nick are here from Tasmania. Imi, his daughter, is here from Auckland. His son Tim is here from the Bay of Islands, and his son Sam and his partner Emily are here from Dunedin. So we are all very, very happy to have all of you here with us this evening. The presence of family members is really just yet another very clear signal about the importance of tonight's event. Now, in addition to members of Lachy's whānau, as I look out on the audience, I see academic and professional staff and students from throughout the university and members of the wider Dunedin community. And I would also like to welcome our Chancellor, Professor Royden Somerville, who I've just had the pleasure of traveling around the world with, but I haven't seen in a couple of weeks. So Royden, it's fantastic to have you here with us today. So to everyone who has gathered with us, no mai haramai, welcome. Now, all of us have taken time out of our busy schedules, not only to share tonight in Lachy's success, but I think more importantly, to learn from him. As you will learn on the basis of his lecture, Professor Paterson is an incredibly creative, prolific, and very well-respected scholar. He is a gifted and popular teacher, both at the graduate and undergraduate level. And last, but certainly not least, he has provided exemplary service, not only to his department, but to the wider university and community as well. This triple crown of outstanding scholarship, training, and teaching and service is really the true hallmark of a University of Otago professor. So Lachy, on behalf of the university, it gives me great pleasure to congratulate you on your very, very well-deserved promotion to professor. I will now call on Professor Poiariwi to tell us just a little bit more about Lachy's academic journey to professor. Nō reira, tena koutou, tena tātou katoa.
Kei aku ranga tira karatahi te pō, karatahi te āmāranga mai ko te maratu e tia e Mauriora. Mihira te whānau, just to endorse Arlene's welcome to you. It's lovely to have you here. So, about Lachy. Born in Southern Hawke's Bay, if you were a rugby follower, he would be a magpie. Raised in Whakatane in the Bay of Plenty, he would be a steamer. Travelling between Dunedin and Palmerston North would make him a Highlander and or a Turbo. But Lachy doesn't actually follow rugby. But his past employments include being a kitchen hand, with the key utensils to make dining better. Worked at the hospital as an orderly and a nurse aide. Again, caring for people, making their current or remaining lives better. As a deer post peeler, a salesperson, and a paper packer, he developed skills and experience in understanding and working with everyday people. And that led him into an academic life. He started here at the University of Otago in history and Māori studies, over at Otago Polytechnic, and then he was a language teacher at Okuna Te Rangatai here in Dunedin. Then he went to Massey University, gave them a hand. I lectured in history and philosophy and classics. After that stint at Massey, he had an epiphany, realized the follies of their travel, and came back to the University of Otago. His research expertise. So one job Lachy would sometimes reflect upon in Te Tumu was working on the railways. So having two tracks, traveling in the same direction, sometimes I think is analogous with his academic career in his pathway. As a non-Māori, a self-proclaimed Pākehā New Zealander, ensconced in Māori language texts, Māori language print culture, the Treaty of Waitangi, Māori social, cultural, political and religious history, the last of which actually earned him the distinction of being an honorary scholar of Te Wānanga-rangi in recognition of his research in Te Akapuaho, which is the Presbyterian Māori Synod. Okay. In terms of his leadership, as Professor Harleen Hain has mentioned, he's had roles in Te Tumu, including acting dean, which you've been appreciative of, and the Division of Humanities and the Wāori University. There are probably only 3 more notches he needs under his belt. Then we can call him our Super Lachy. Pro Vice Chancellor, Division of Humanities. Vice Chancellor at the University of Otago. And of course the IPL, which you've all come to listen to this evening. So Te Tumu is proud to have Lachy, the grandson, the grandfather, the son, the father, the brother, a colleague, a mentor, a friend, a researcher, an academic whip in Te Tumu, a socialite, an author, an editor, a scholar, an alumnus of the University of Otago, and now a professor with us. So as a non-Māori, as I mentioned, to lecture, research, and author on race, Māori and Pākehā, colonialism in New Zealand, on Pākehā societal norms and views of equality and race mixing, requires a great deal of intestinal and testicular fortitude. So to take on such a challenge exemplifies the attitude that Lachy has as one individual that might lead New Zealand into a society that's even better than it is now. So whānau, friends and colleagues, please welcome Lachlan to present his inaugural professorial lecture.
Tuatahi. Me mihi atu au ki te tumu aki o te whare nei. Professor Harleen Hain, tēnā koe. He nui hoki aku mihi ki te pai whakahirehira nei. Tēnā koutou. Tēnā koa te ngākau. I te taenga mai o ngā tāngata. Ki koa nei ki te tautoko i te kaupapa nei. Ko wai koutou, ko tōku whānau, ko oku hoa mahi, ko oku hoa. Me rātu hoki. Nā reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Nā me ki, e hara taku toa i te toa takitai, he toa takitini care. The trouble is, there's just too many of you to mention. First, I'd like to thank, though, my parents for raising me. My partner, Angela, and all my family for their support and encouragement. Now, in the various roles in Te Tumu, Division of Humanities, and a spell in the clock tower as well, I've had the pleasure to work alongside many admin people. And I'd just like to say that our academic activities would grind to a halt without the professional staff. So in particular, I'd like to call out to Robin Russell, Carol Forbes, and Susan Craig for their day-to-day help when I was doing those roles. But I'd also like to call out to people like Gary Whitty, Chris Stoddard, and Gregor Macaulay, because they were my go-to people for advice on the Byzantine intricacies of university administration. So a big thank you to all the professional staff I've worked with. I've also been really lucky to have had great colleagues in Te Tumu, in particular my PhD supervisor and our previous dean, Professor Michael Riley, and our current dean, Professor Poia Rewi, for their wisdom and their support. Also, my huamahi I roto I te tima reo Māori, so it's Megan, Karen, Tangiwai, Gianna, and Craig, as well as all my colleagues in Pacific Island Studies and Indigenous Development. On the research side, I would especially like to acknowledge my involvement in the Centre for Research on Colonial Culture, headed by Tony Ballantyne and Angela Wanhala. It's called CROC. And it's stimulated a number of collaborations of which I've been a part. Several of these have been with Angela, including our current Marsden project on Māori home front during World War II. So a big thank you to all the people, professional, academic staff, students, and friends who I've worked with and have helped me in the years that I've been here at Otago. Now, I've been to quite a few of these, and people normally start off talking a little bit about their early influences. I grew up in Whakatane in the Bay of Plenty in the 1960s and 70s. These were fairly prosperous times when New Zealand still had a well-functioning welfare state, and most people had jobs that they could survive on. Now, I have to concede I grew up in a somewhat innocent and naive environment. I was sheltered by my parents, but I think also by the time period that I grew up in. Now, Whakatane has a large Māori population, and I even lived in a pepper-potted street. That's a street with Māori and Pākehā that sort of aligned with the government's residential policy. But despite their proximity, Māori and Pākehā back then mainly mixed through schooling, work, and sport. It's not to say that other interactions didn't take place, but many Pākehā, this is in a district with 40% Māori population, didn't really have much to do with their Māori neighbours on a day-to-day basis. David Orsubel, who is a US sociologist, who published The Tiki and the Fern in 1960. This was an outsider's take on New Zealand society. He spent quite a bit of his time in the town, and 1860 was about the time that I shifted there as a child. And he noticed that the Strand, which is Whakatane's main shopping street, employed no Māori shop assistants at that time. Now, about 100 years prior to these photos, there'd been war, destruction, land confiscations, and subsequent occupation by the armed constabulary. Less than 50 years before these, the government mounted a terror raid on Uruakenana at Maunga Pohatu, resulting in 2 deaths. Now, I wasn't that conscious as a child as to how close colonialism was in terms of time and place. I was 5 in the premise when this photo was taken. I'm one of the kids directly behind the sign, if you weren't sure. What we can see is that there were almost as many Māori kids as Pākehā ones. Now, I liked school. I generally did quite well. And I was lucky that I grew up in a home with books where I was encouraged to learn. Back then, there was only one high school in town, Whakatane High, and by the time I got to the fourth form 9 years later, classes were streamed, and there was just one Māori girl in my class, and she called herself part Māori. And this seems incredible when Māori made up about 40% of the school's catchment. Now, Pierre Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital, of course, comes to mind. That schools reflect dominant cultural values. They employ teachers who favour children whose backgrounds and values most closely resemble their own. It's therefore, kia ora haiata. It's therefore not surprising that middle-class Pākehā children did well at school, and those from different cultural upbringings, whether this was their class or ethnicity, less so. However, the fact that I mixed less with Māori kids at high school, because we also tended to play different sports, was not something I really dwelt on at the time. It would be nice to say that my childhood in Whakatane gave me a deep understanding of Te Ao Māori, but that would be wrong. After a moderately misspent youth, I ended up in this province and drifted into my previous career in the New Zealand Railways, first as a track worker and then as a signal maintainer. I began learning Te Reo Māori in the early 90s. I'd been good at languages at school, and my wife at the time had started a BA in Māori studies, so I started to learn as well, although less formally. I taught myself from books, went to night classes, and finally did bursary Māori through correspondence school. Then all of a sudden, 1996, my railway career came to a sudden halt when I became a solo dad. I took the opportunity to become a university student. My plans were pretty flexible at the time. Get a degree. That was it. And I ended up doing Māori studies and history because I enjoyed them. Now, I remember back then talking to another mature student. He was a Māori guy. And I started moaning about how hard it was being a Pākehā student in Māori studies. And how I always felt a little bit on the outside when all the other students were Māori. And he looked at me and he snapped back, Lachy, when I walk out of here, that's what I experience every day of my life. So nowadays, we might talk in terms of white privilege. But 20 odd years ago, that kind of discourse wasn't really available. Now, sometimes the best lessons are actually learned outside of the classroom. Anyway, I knew that I'd been a prat. Indeed, Māori studies at Otago, and this was in the days of Godfrey and Tōroa Pohatu, has always been incredibly open to all comers. So I went on to do a PG dip in Māori studies. I didn't have any real idea of what I should do my 490 dissertation on, but I was fortunate that Professor Moorfield employed me as a research assistant. So I was scouring Newspaper are old Māori language newspapers, and I was looking for loan words that were used in Māori but derived from English and other languages. And I thought, I'm getting paid to read these newspapers for this linguistic research. I might as well use them to collect my own data at the same time for my historical purposes. So I was getting paid to do my own research, as it were. So I looked at Māori-run Anglican Church newspaper Te Pipi Wharaurua, which ran from the turn of the last century when it had very strong links to Young Māori Party. Now, it's probably worth mentioning here that newspaper aren't like newspapers today. They're anything from the size of an academic journal to maybe a tabloid. Some of them are only a few pages long, and if they had news in them, it was probably weeks and weeks out of date. But more importantly, none of these new pepa made any money. Their primary goal was to promote particular discourses and to influence Māori thinking and behaviour. So this might be for government agenda, church and evangelical purposes, or for Māori political causes such as the kingitanga or kotahitanga. I carried on with the same research work while doing my PhD, again gathering historical data for my own thesis on the side, and this time concentrating on the 8 years leading up to July 1863, when the British Army invaded the Waikato. So what were Māori, this is my question, what were Māori reading in the various periodicals available at the time? And what was going on in New Zealand in a period when it seemed to be transitioning from what was meant to be a peaceful and prosperous existence, where at least lip service was being paid to the Treaty of Waitangi, to all-out war? Reflecting on my research to date on New Pepa, my focus has tended to be on discourse and race relations, hence my topic for today. And what I want to focus on this evening are some of the contradictions around discourses on race, as seen in the country's newspapers. I use the word race. Race, of course, is a social construct based on power, but it's also been one that's been a dominant factor in New Zealand history and Māori Pākehā relations. So first on, I'll look at some early discussions on race in the Māori New Pepa during the first 2 decades of colonisation. And then a little bit on mixed-race marriage, finishing with some race issues that arose in the Pākehā newspapers. Now, I won't need to make too many direct links to today, as you're all very intelligent people, who I'm sure will be able to see the ghosts of the past reflected in today's world. But I must warn you that you may see or hear some terms that are not really appropriate today. It might even be considered offensive, but were part of common parlance in the past. So Māori, thanks to the treaty, had the same rights as Englishmen. And it was Englishmen who sought to shape and rule the new colony. The settlers brought and imbibed various racial ideas prevalent in the English-speaking world. So if, as their colony was growing, they were seeking to exclude Chinese, Indians, blacks, and others from their new white homeland, what did this mean for Māori, their fellow citizens? And the only conclusion that I've been able to make is that New Zealand's colonisation has been about creating a country for white men. If this wasn't explicit in 1840, then it certainly was by 1860. And the issue for Māori was how they were expected to fit in or stand aside so as not to be a hindrance or impediment to settler progress. Now, this isn't any different to colonial projects in other lands, but Māori did have the moderately good fortune that the treaty was signed at the height of humanitarianism. So unlike the indigenous people of Australia or the eastern North America, Māori ownership of land was at least recognised, and Māori, at least in theory, had equal political rights. The government therefore sought to communicate with Māori, including through newspapers, to persuade them of the benefits of colonisation, that as subjects of the Queen, they too could enjoy modernity, citizenship, and the rule of law. Both Māori and Pākehā could advance into the new dawn together. So law, for example, was something that Māori could assess and take up if they wanted, like they had with Christianity. Of course, this was a dissimulation. The government aspired to secure its own authority, and over time was prepared to use force to do it. And we can see this contradiction at Kohimarama in 1860, when Governor Brown, who was addressing Māori chiefs, trumpeted that New Zealand was, quote, the only colony where they, Māori, have been invited to unite with the colonists and become one people under one law, and that, quote, New Zealand is the first country colonised on this new and humane system. This, of course, sounds a little bit like a former Prime Minister who recently claimed that New Zealand had been peacefully settled. Of course, at Kohimarama, Brown was concerned with the kingitanga and the war in Taranaki, and his talk of oneness also came with a threat. If Māori didn't fall into line, he said, they could risk ruin, or in the Māori text, destruction. The official government line was one of harmony and unity, but as we will see, New Zealand's colonisation was founded on notions of inequality based on racial and cultural difference. As we can see here from this little excerpt, it's Māori who must learn from Pākehā, fit into the Pākehā world in order for the country to advance. And we can also see that the translations are not always quite the same. But this is an idea that's still promulgated today by those who suggest that we're all just New Zealanders and that our nationality should trump all other aspects of identity or rights. As in the 19th century, mid-19th century, the underlying notion is that it's the Pākehā cultural mainstream that should predominate. But the 19th century message was also unequivocally racialised. If, as Fanon suggests, colonisation is Manichaean, then race forms a natural dichotomy. In other words, Māori and Pākehā. The word Māori also means normal. But in this new world, it was also a general term for native. Māori could also mean without restraint. And I'm not sure whether this was a missionary construction, but it's certainly developed in missionary discourse and in the newspapers to translate as excitable, uncivilized, violent, and dark. And it could be transposed quite widely. For example, when discussing the Roman conquest of Britain, New Paper suggested that civilized Romans were Pākehā, wearing Pākehā clothes, and that Britons were wild with Māori-like customs. And we can also see it in the expression ngākau Māori, a native heart, one which is devoid of civilization and is holding Māori back. So the message is that Māori were Māori as a race, but they were told that they should strive to give up their very nativeness. The racial dichotomy extended to colour, with kirimā, white skin, and kirimangu, black skin, used to differentiate between the two groups. Black and white are complementary opposites, used here as theoretical constructs. And by utilising this term in their newspaper, ironically to suggest a commonality, the writer is instead setting the groups apart as far as he can. Similarly, in the same article, the author defines Māori as teina, younger brothers. Māori society is hierarchical, and the language defines sibling relationships in terms of senior and junior terms. So in these discourses, Māori were nearly always, I've only found one case where it wasn't, portrayed in the junior position. Now, the other bit that I've highlighted is the word whakarangatira, which literally means to make chiefly or to make noble. My research has shown that the term rangatiratanga has had a checkered colonial past with different meanings in different contexts. At this time, missionaries and officials alike often used it to define civilization, something that Māori were to aspire to, but had not yet reached. So the new pepa were aimed at Māori chiefs who were constantly reminded that in Pākehā eyes, they might be rangatira or chiefs politically, but had not yet reached the high levels of cultural rangatiratanga expected of them. So, despite the notion of oneness, Māori as a race were black, uncivilised, and not ready for equality. They should therefore trust their Pākehā elder brother, who did possess rangatiratanga, and leave the running of the colony to him. Now, it's not surprising that the kingitanga, anti-colonial movement that aspired to establish an autonomous Māori kingdom, recycled or critiqued some of this discourse. Māoriness and blackness became attributes around which to build a Māori rather than a tribal identity. For example, the kingitanga newspaper Te Hokioi even looked outside of New Zealand, employing the example of Haiti as a model of non-white anti-colonial success. And it portrayed this in terms of blackness, kirimangu, that could be applied directly to its own situation. Similarly, when Māori King addressed all Māori, so his supporters as well as those that were aligned to Queen Victoria, he did so through the shared racial identity in opposition to colonists' whiteness. But you're asking, why does this even matter? Wasn't it just a matter of time when Māori would fade away, either swept aside in the face of a superior race or absorbed into it? This was the accepted truth for many Pākehā, and even a few Māori. Certainly, as Damon Salisa has argued, intermarriage, racial crossings, were a 19th century colonial concern. Interestingly, in New Zealand, the early governors sought to foster mixed marriage as a way of increasing Pākehā influence. Now, Angela Wanhala has also shown there was extensive intermarriage over time, but with a small Māori base and a continuing flood of Pākehā immigrants, and with most of the mixed-race children living within Māori communities, this impacted Māori society way more than Pākehā. But people of mixed ancestry, or what they were called half-castes, were an issue for Pākehā. If colonisation was premised on political, cultural, and social divisions according to race, where did this leave people who had a dual heritage? And if you wanted a white New Zealand without blacks, Chinese, and Indians, how much of an existential threat was racial mixing to the colonial vision? And this was also at a time when science was still grappling with fundamental questions around hybridity. Were these so-called half-caste children more likely to grow up as weak and infertile creatures, or with the best qualities of both their parents? Now, at a public meeting in 1873, James Buller, the old missionary, suggested that he could see no reason why a blending of the races by intermarriage might not come about, which would supposedly improve the Māori race. Of course, Buller thought that Māori would need to become more polished, that is, speaking English and assimilating into Pākehā ways. Now, these were not sentiments shared by all. Noble Digger, for example, attacked this argument, even suggesting that he would prefer his sisters or daughters dead rather than married to a Māori man. These were not fringe ideas, but they were part of the mainstream. Indeed, in 1899, several newspapers reproduced uncritically a piece from the London Spectator on intermarriage that stated that while some interracial unions might be fruitful, quote, a marriage between the colours affirms to some extent the equality of the colours, and the affirmation is repugnant to the white man. Supported by history, he firmly believes his colour to be the mark of a hereditary aristocracy of mankind, and he regards any degradation of that aristocracy as a personal insult, to be prevented if possible, or at least to be bitterly resented. I would imagine that many white supremacists today would probably echo those kinds of ideas. Māori in the 19th century did not have the same anxiety over racial mixing. By the 1870s, their concerns appear to be more about issues of mana. So land ownership, which was a source of mana, was increasingly under threat. So Ngāi Tahu, for example, argued for separate reserves specifically for half-castes. But this was an attempt to increase the pie rather than to fight over the little that remained. Similarly, Māori representation in Parliament was limited, so there was some politicking around whether mixed-race individuals should be putting themselves forward for election. Now, the only outlier that I've found in the Māori language press has been the Anglican Church's Te Pipi Wharaurua from 1907, and this piece written, I believe, by Reverend Reweti Kohere. Kohere was critiquing Maui Pōmari's prediction that the Māori race would eventually disappear through absorption into Pākehā. Although he had one Pākehā grandparent himself, Kohere uses the same racial dichotomy of black and whiteness. But his concerns are less about blood than ethnicity, that is, culture and identity. Kohere sought to maintain Māori language and culture, and he believed that absorption through intermarriage was a threat to this. But his main concern was around land, and he provided details of a number of Māori wealthy landholders who had married Pākehā or who had adopted Pākehā children, and argued that the land would be inevitably lost through inheritance. He said, quote, "Each person should have a say over their own land, but land is not something created by people, but handed down by the ancestors to their descendants. And it's only right that our land of the Māori should be left to Māori." Now, I want to move on to some research I've done on Pākehā attitudes to race in New Zealand. Scholars like Tony Ballantyne have looked at how intellectuals debated and shared racial theories such as Aryanism. But what did ordinary people think? And how was race portrayed to them in the settler newspapers? Let us not think that New Zealand was somehow superior to other white settler colonies with regard to racial attitudes. Like other places, blacked up minstrels singing plantation songs, such as these future school teachers, were a popular entertainment in New Zealand for most of our history. Indeed, I grew up with the black and white minstrels on TV. Our colonial newspapers also printed racist jokes and anecdotes that circulated the English-speaking world. And books like this were bestsellers in the 1960s. Now, this is very anecdotal. People want science, don't they? I wanted to get a more quantitative picture on racial discourse, so I mined our nation's newspapers to find occurrences of something that's very offensive, and that is the N-word. Now, I have to acknowledge some methodological issues with the online corpus of newspapers. There are fewer newspapers in the early years, they had fewer pages, and not all papers have been digitised. But what we do see is the word appearing increasingly in newspapers over time. However, if we look at the 1920s, it's quite a peak. So I do need to explain that. Although the word had been used for advertisements, such as for minstrel sheet music and for tobacco products, from about 1914 it gained an extra meaning of a dark brown colour, in particular referring to fabrics. And it is this usage that resulted in the huge increase in occurrences. But what this tells us is that the word was normalised in common discourse, even more so once it entered the vocabulary as a simple colour. Your average reader wouldn't have batted an eye at looking at it. And this was despite an awareness, even then, that the term was actually extremely offensive. Where it was used in newspaper articles and such like, it was generally applied to black people, whether from Australia, Africa, or America. And although on the streets it may have been used to refer to Māori, this was definitely not acceptable in print. So when John Duffy, an opposition member for Wellington, made this comment in 1899, a political storm broke out. Prominent chiefs called on him to withdraw his statement, which they saw as a deliberate insult to Māori as subjects of the Queen. And the Premier, Richard Seddon, played it for all it was worth. G'day, Tom. Despite Duffy apologising for what he called a regrettable use of a common and vulgar expression. Now, some newspapers were prepared to critique the insult as being inappropriate to Māori. It was a matter of pride to Pākehā self-identity that the best colony in the world, New Zealand, should naturally possess the best natives as well. Despite this Māori exceptionalism, there was little criticism of Duffy's central underlying argument that land should belong to Pākehā and not to Māori. New Zealand was still a colony of settlement, predicated on policies that left most Māori with little land, impoverished, in substandard housing, and socially and politically marginalised. I found a number of statements in Pākehā newspapers that extol Māori in comparison to other lesser native peoples, but they never critique the internal logics of colonialism. Okay, so my last story, I guess, was one that was covered in a number of newspapers in 1912, when Kurupo Tariha, a former New Zealand golf champion, was banned from buying a ticket in the dress circle of a local picture theatre on the pretext that some Māori in the past had misbehaved. He subsequently complained to the Napier Council, who sought legal advice, but to no avail. Now, most newspapers declared themselves to be astonished at the ban, but they didn't actively condemn it. Nor did John Payne, a cinema owner and member of Parliament, suffer politically for this act of racial exclusion. The only newspaper to actively editorialise was The Truth, admittedly the most scandal-mongering periodical of its time, but it endorsed the ban on Māori as a means of showing them that they were not equal to Pākehā. While it considered that some Māori might be thorough gentlemen, it blamed the government for pampering them and protecting their remaining lands from alienation. And this allowed Māori to become arrogant and overbearing. Quite apart from being false, this discourse resonates with current ones that argue that Māori somehow have undeserved privileges. So I hope that this little traipse through the colonial newspapers has shown that issues of race have been a constant preoccupation through our nation's history, although primarily a Pākehā concern and not without its contradictions. In the 1840s and 50s, the government portrayed civilisation in terms of a cultural gap that Māori were expected to bridge. Didn't Labour have a policy bridging the gaps? Chiefs were rangatira, but did not possess the cultural rangatiratanga of the Pākehā, so they should surrender the running of the country to their more knowledgeable Pākehā brethren. But race was also defined in terms of a stark dichotomy, black and white skins. Māori were Māori, but they had to give up their ngākau Māori. It's therefore not surprising that the kingitanga, struggling to build a pan-Māori identity and maintain mana Māori motuhake, would utilise the same racial discourse of difference. We've looked briefly at the issue of race mixing, another Pākehā preoccupation, some in favour, some against. And then how settler papers interacted with issues of race. New Zealand was certainly part of a broader global circulation of generic racist material directed against people of colour, specifically blacks. As the natives of a superior colony, Māori were generally exempted from the worst vilification, such as the N-word. But that exception was only relevant in opposition to other peoples of colour. Colonialism still ground on in New Zealand, assimilating Māori culturally, taking their lands, while pushing them to the social, political and economic margins. Now, I have to confess that for many years I've subscribed to Whiggish beliefs that while the world was not perfect, life was slowly and inevitably improving. Yet when we look around, we see for some groups, life has become much harder over recent years. Well, maybe at least a more liberal world was emerging where racism, hatred and suffering were on the retreat and where we abhorred the racial prejudice of our forebears. This is maybe naive. As we're seeing in some countries, society can retrogress and liberal gains may be lost. It's therefore incumbent upon us at a time when some people believe that free speech means the right to say whatever they want, that we resist any attempts to revert to the discourses of yesteryear. Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Tony Ballantyne and I'm the PVC Humanities here at Otago. And it is with very great pleasure that I'll deliver a vote of thanks to Professor Paterson. Professor Paterson, Lachy, has delivered an excellent lecture which has offered a thoughtful exploration of the intersections between print culture, race and colonialism. The histories he has explored and the texts that he has shared with us this evening offer a very important vantage point on the logics of colonial domination and its cultural legacies. But they've also underscored, I think, the richness of Māori cultural and intellectual history, highlighting some of the arguments and strategies that Māori leaders adopted in the face of the inequalities of a social order made by empire. This evening, Lachy has given you a taste of his research, and I would encourage you, or those of you who haven't read much of his work, to seek it out, because it offers powerful insights into the interplay between power and culture in the shaping of our society. And just wearing my historian's hat, you know, there is a long-standing argument, most clearly articulated by Keith Sinclair, about the superiority of New Zealand race relations, and that's been very clearly put to rest this evening. It was also very interesting to hear Professor Paterson's reflections on his own journey and his own pathway into academia. His thoughts on growing up in whakatane and the powerful but very partial understandings of cultural difference that we develop as children, I think would resonate with many New Zealanders. And those reflections also demonstrated the ways in which the opportunity structure in our society was and is profoundly racialised right from childhood. Lachy's lecture was both self-deprecating and generous towards others. I don't think there's any surprise there. He is a great institutional citizen, somebody who works very hard with his students and who has served Te Tumu, the Division of Humanities and the university generously and very well. And I know firsthand that Lachy is a great research collaborator. Thinking hard about the relationships between communication and the construction of cultural difference is an urgent undertaking right now. Both within New Zealand cultural life and on the global stage, we have figures, including a new cohort of leaders, who use words as weapons to vilify, to dehumanise, and to legitimise extremism, hatred and violence. Your lecture this evening, Lachy, has reminded us all that language, how we speak, how we write, how we interpret texts, is central to how we define and make communities. So, Professor Paterson, I know that all of us here, students, colleagues from Te Tumu, from across the division and the wider university, family and friends, are just delighted to be sharing this very special occasion with you. So could you please join me in thanking Lachy? I do have a gift to present to him, and after that I would encourage you to follow us to the staff club where we'll have a reception.